The Nebraska sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth, creating heat mirages that danced across Samuel Morrison's forgotten farm. At 67, Sam had weathered more storms than most, both literal and metaphorical, but nothing had prepared him for the slow death of his dreams. The once thriving wheat fields now lay barren, victim to 3 consecutive years of drought and the bank's relentless pursuit of overdue mortgage payments. Sam wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he trudged toward the old water pump behind his farmhouse. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, the same dust that had buried his hopes along with his crops. The silence was deafening. No rustling of wheat stalks, no distant sound of neighbors working their fields, just the occasional creak of his dilapidated barn in the hot wind. The farmhouse, once painted a cheerful yellow by his late wife Martha 30 years ago, now stood like a ghost of better times. Paint peeled from its sides like old skin, and several shutters hung askew. The front porch, where Martha used to sit shelling peas and watching their children play, sagged under the weight of neglect. Those children were grown now, scattered across the country with lives and families of their own, too busy or too ashamed to visit their father's failing farm. Sam's last neighbor, the Hendersons, had sold out to a corporate farming conglomerate 6 months ago. Their departure had felt like the final nail in the coffin of the close-knit farming community that had once thrived in this corner of Nebraska. Now, the nearest occupied house was 15 miles away, leaving Sam in a bubble of isolation that seemed to grow thicker with each passing day. As he worked the rusty pump handle, trying to coax even a trickle of water from the increasingly reluctant well, a faint whimpering sound caught his attention. At first, he thought it might be the wind playing tricks on him. After months of solitude, his mind sometimes conjured sounds that weren't there, but the whimpering came again, weak but unmistakably real. Following the sound, Sam walked around the corner of his barn, past the rusted skeleton of his old tractor that had died 2 summers ago. There, in a shallow depression near the barn's foundation, lay a small golden retriever puppy. The little creature couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old, its fur matted with dust and its tiny body barely moving with each labored breath. "Well, I'll be damned," Sam muttered, kneeling down despite the protest from his arthritic knees. The puppy's eyes were barely open, clouded with exhaustion and dehydration. Its pink tongue lolled out, dry as the cracked earth around it. Sam gently scooped up the tiny animal, surprised by how light it felt in his calloused hands. The puppy's breathing was shallow and rapid, and Sam could feel its little heart racing against his palm. For a moment, he was transported back to when his own children were small, when Martha would bring home stray cats and injured birds, turning their kitchen into a makeshift animal hospital. "Where did you come from, little one?" Sam whispered, looking around for any sign of the puppy's mother or siblings. The landscape offered no clues, just endless stretches of empty farmland and the distant outline of abandoned buildings on the horizon. Carrying the puppy carefully, Sam hurried back to the farmhouse. The screen door squeaked on its hinges as he pushed through into the kitchen. The room still smelled faintly of Martha's lavender sachets, though she'd been gone for 5 years now. Sam had left everything exactly as she'd arranged it, finding comfort in the familiar placement of her ceramic roosters on the windowsill and her checkered tablecloth on the small dining table. He grabbed a clean dish towel from the drawer and gently wrapped the puppy, then used an eyedropper to give it small amounts of water. The little creature's tongue moved slightly, a good sign that it was still fighting. Sam found himself talking to the puppy as he worked, his voice rough from disuse. "You picked quite a place to collapse, little fellow. This old farm isn't much to look at anymore, but we'll see what we can do for you." As the evening approached, Sam set up a makeshift bed for the puppy in a small cardboard box lined with one of Martha's old quilts. He placed the box near the wood-burning stove in the living room, even though the late summer heat made the extra warmth unnecessary. Something about the gesture felt right, like he was creating a sanctuary within his own sanctuary. The puppy's condition seemed to stabilize slightly with the water and the comfortable environment. Its breathing became less labored, though it remained unconsciously still. Sam found himself checking on the tiny animal every few minutes, his usual evening routine of reading farming magazines and listening to old radio shows forgotten. As darkness fell over the Nebraska plains, Sam sat in his worn recliner, the puppy's box within arm's reach. The silence that had oppressed him for months now felt different somehow, less empty, more expectant. Through the window he could see stars beginning to appear in the vast sky, the same stars he and Martha used to watch from this very chair. "Martha would have loved you," he said softly to the sleeping puppy. She always said animals found their way to people who needed them most. For the first time in months, Sam didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness as he prepared for bed. Something had shifted in the universe of his small world, something as simple and profound as a dying puppy, trusting him enough to fight for another day. He checked on the puppy one last time before heading to his bedroom, adjusting the quilt around the small form and whispering a prayer he hadn't spoken since Martha's funeral. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he wasn't alone. Sam woke before sunrise, as he had every day for the past 40 years. The habit was so ingrained that even retirement from active farming hadn't broken the rhythm, but this morning felt different. Instead of the usual dread that accompanied his awakening, the mental inventory of unpaid bills and failing equipment, his first thought was of the tiny golden retriever puppy sleeping in the living room. He padded quietly across the creaking floorboards, his bare feet navigating the familiar path in the pre-dawn darkness. The house felt less hollow somehow, filled with a purpose he hadn't experienced since Martha's passing. As he approached the makeshift bed, his heart caught in his throat. The puppy was sitting up, its bright brown eyes alert and focused on Sam's approach. "Well, hello there, little survivor," Sam whispered, kneeling beside the box. The transformation was remarkable. The puppy's coat, while still dusty, had regained some of its natural luster. Its breathing was steady and strong, and when Sam extended his hand, the little creature sniffed curiously before giving his finger a tentative lick. Sam carefully lifted the puppy, checking for any signs of injury or distress. Finding none, he carried it to the kitchen where he prepared a mixture of warm milk and water in a shallow dish. The puppy lapped eagerly, its tiny tail wagging with increasing enthusiasm as strength returned to its small body. "You're going to need a name," Sam mused, watching the puppy drink. "Can't keep calling you little fellow forever." He studied the golden fur and bright, intelligent eyes. "How about Goldie? Simple, but it suits you." As if responding to its new name, the puppy looked up at Sam and barked, a small, squeaky sound that nevertheless filled the kitchen with more life than it had contained in years. Sam found himself chuckling, a sound that surprised him with its rusty unfamiliarity. After Goldie had eaten and relieved herself on some newspapers Sam had laid out, he decided to take her outside for some fresh air. The morning was still cool, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of distant rain clouds, a smell that always stirred hope in a farmer's heart, even a forgotten one like Sam. He sat on the front porch steps with Goldie in his lap, watching the sun rise over the empty fields. The puppy seemed content to simply exist in the moment, occasionally tilting her head at the sound of a meadowlark's call or the distant rumble of a truck on the county road. "It's not much of a kingdom, Goldie," Sam said, scratching behind her ears, "but it's ours, I suppose. At least until the bank decides otherwise." As the morning progressed, Sam found himself energized in a way he hadn't felt in months. He cleaned out the old chicken coop, thinking it might make a good shelter for Goldie when she grew larger. He fixed the wobbly step on the front porch that had been bothering him for weeks. Small tasks, but each one felt like a victory against the entropy that had been slowly claiming his farm. Around 10 o'clock, as Sam was repairing a section of fence near the barn, he heard an unusual sound drifting across the empty fields. At first he thought it might be the wind, but as it grew closer, he realized it was singing, children's voices raised in harmony, carrying a melody he vaguely recognized from his youth. Goldie, who had been napping in the shade of the barn, suddenly perked up, her ears alert and tail wagging. The singing grew louder, accompanied by the creaking of wagon wheels and the clip-clop of horses' hooves on the dusty road. Sam straightened up, using his hand to shield his eyes from the sun as he peered toward the county road. What he saw made him question whether the isolation had finally affected his sanity. A procession of horse-drawn wagons was approaching his farm, filled with children of various ages, all singing in unison. The lead wagon was driven by a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, her face kind but determined. As the wagons turned into his driveway, Sam stood frozen, uncertain whether to retreat into his house or stay and face whatever this unexpected visit might bring. Goldie had no such hesitation. She bounded toward the approaching visitors with the fearless enthusiasm that only puppies possess. The lead wagon pulled up near the farmhouse, and the woman climbed down with practiced ease. Behind her, children of all ages began disembarking from the various wagons, their excited chatter mixing with the sounds of horses snorting and harnesses jingling. "Mr. Morrison," the woman called out, approaching with a warm smile. "I'm Catherine Walsh from the Meadowbrook Children's Home in Lincoln. I hope we're not imposing, but we heard you might be able to help us with something. Sam removed his worn baseball cap, running his fingers through his thinning gray hair. Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been some mistake. I'm not sure what kind of help you think I can provide. Catherine's smile widened as she watched Goldie playing with a group of children who had gathered around the puppy. Actually, Mr. Morrison, it's more about what we can help you with. You see, we received a rather unusual phone call this morning from someone who said you'd found a lost puppy and might need some assistance caring for it. I don't understand, Sam said, bewildered. I haven't called anyone. In fact, my phone's been disconnected for 3 months. That's the mystery, isn't it? Catherine replied, her eyes twinkling with amusement. But here we are, and these children have been so excited about the possibility of helping care for a puppy that I couldn't bear to disappoint them. We were hoping you might let them spend some time here, maybe help with some farm chores in exchange for puppy time. Sam looked around at the children, who ranged in age from about 6 to 16. Their faces were bright with anticipation, and several were already kneeling beside Goldie, who seemed to be in absolute heaven with all the attention. For the first time in years, his farm was filled with laughter and life. I suppose, Sam said slowly, there's always work to be done on a farm. Within an hour of the children's arrival, Sam's farm had transformed into something he barely recognized. What had been a monument to isolation and decay suddenly buzzed with purposeful activity. The older children, led by a 16-year-old named Marcus with gentle eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work, had taken to the farm chores with an enthusiasm that both amazed and humbled Sam. Mr. Morrison, sir, Marcus said, approaching with a respectful nod. Miss Catherine says you might have some tools we could use to clear out that overgrown vegetable garden behind the house. Some of us have been learning about sustainable farming at the home, and we'd love to help get it back in shape. Sam stared at the boy, then toward the garden that had been Martha's pride and joy. He hadn't been able to bring himself to tend it since her death, and it had become a tangle of weeds and volunteer plants. You'd want to work in that mess? Yes, sir. We've got nothing but time and energy, Marcus grinned. And honestly, working with our hands feels good. Beats sitting around the home with nothing productive to do. Meanwhile, the younger children had appointed themselves as Goldie's personal care committee. 8-year-old Lucy, a girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, had fashioned a small collar from a piece of rope and was teaching the puppy to walk on a makeshift leash. 10-year-old twins, Jake and Jamie, were constructing an elaborate obstacle course using overturned buckets and pieces of old lumber they'd found behind the barn. Catherine Walsh watched the scene unfold from the farmhouse porch, where she sat with Sam sharing a pitcher of iced tea he'd hastily prepared. The children needed this as much as you do, she said quietly. Most of them come from difficult situations, broken homes, families that couldn't care for them properly. Being able to contribute, to feel useful and wanted, it's therapeutic in ways you might not realize. Sam watched 12-year-old Sarah, a quiet girl with serious eyes, gently brushing Goldie's coat with an old dog brush he'd found in the barn. The puppy sat perfectly still, clearly enjoying the attention. What's her story? He asked. Sarah's been with us for 2 years. Her grandmother raised her until she passed away last spring. Sarah hasn't spoken much since then, but look at her now. Indeed, Sarah was whispering softly to Goldie, her face more animated than it had been since arriving. As the afternoon wore on, Sam found himself drawn into the children's projects despite his initial reluctance. When 14-year-old David asked for help identifying which plants in the garden were weeds and which were herbs that had gone wild, Sam discovered he remembered more of Martha's gardening wisdom than he'd realized. This here's mint, he said, pointing to a sprawling patch of green. Martha used to make tea with it, said it settled the stomach. He paused, surprised by how easily the memory had surfaced. And this tangled mess is actually rosemary. Tough as nails, that plant. Even thrives on neglect. David nodded eagerly, making mental notes. Could we maybe harvest some of this stuff? Miss Catherine's been teaching us about natural remedies and she makes amazing herb teas. By late afternoon, the transformation was remarkable. The garden, while still requiring weeks of work, showed clear pathways and organized sections. The children had swept out the barn, organized tools that had been scattered haphazardly, and even managed to coax Sam's old tractor into starting with some creative problem-solving and mechanical intuition from Marcus. But it was the change in atmosphere that struck Sam most profoundly. The oppressive silence that had dominated his days was replaced by laughter, conversation, and the simple sounds of people working together toward common goals. Goldie seemed to sense the shift too, playing with boundless energy and sleeping peacefully in whatever lap happened to be available. As evening approached, Catherine began organizing the children for departure. "We should head back before dark," she announced, though her tone suggested she was as reluctant to leave as the children clearly were. "Miss Catherine," Lucy piped up, still cradling Goldie, "do we have to go? Goldie needs us, and Mr. Morrison has so much work that we could help with." Sam felt something stir in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced since Martha's death. These children, who had appeared seemingly from nowhere, had given him something precious, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. "Well," he said slowly, his voice rougher than usual, "I suppose if Miss Catherine doesn't mind, you could come back tomorrow. There's certainly more work than one old man can handle." The children's cheers were so enthusiastic that even Goldie began barking excitedly. Catherine smiled, but Sam noticed a flicker of something, worry perhaps, cross her features. "Mr. Morrison, I should probably explain something," she said, as the children began loading back into the wagons. "We're actually facing some challenges at the home. Budget cuts from the state, and we may have to close our doors within the next few months. These children, they'll be split up, sent to different facilities across the state." Sam felt his heart sink. In one day, these kids had become more than visitors. They'd become a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. "How long do you have?" "Maybe 3 months if we're lucky. We've been trying to find alternative solutions, but..." Catherine shrugged helplessly. As the wagons pulled away, the children waving and calling promises to return tomorrow, Sam stood in his suddenly quiet farmyard with Goldie at his feet. The silence felt different now, not empty but full of possibility. He looked down at the puppy, who was watching the departing wagons with what seemed like understanding in her bright eyes. "What do you think, Goldie?" he asked softly. "Think this old farm might have some life left in it after all?" The puppy wagged her tail and looked up at him with absolute faith, as if she'd known all along that rescue could flow in both directions. 3 weeks had passed since the children first arrived at Sam's farm, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. What had begun as a single day of help had evolved into a daily routine that breathed new life into both the forgotten farm and its inhabitants. Every morning, Sam would wake to the sound of approaching wagons and children's voices, and every evening he would watch them leave with a mixture of satisfaction and growing dread. The farm itself bore little resemblance to the desolate place it had been just a month ago. The vegetable garden flourished under the children's dedicated care, producing tomatoes, peppers, and herbs that filled the farmhouse kitchen with aromas Sam hadn't experienced in years. The barn had been cleaned, organized, and even painted by the older boys, while the younger children had created a proper play area for Goldie, complete with agility equipment and shaded resting spots. But it was the change in the children themselves that moved Sam most deeply. Sarah, the quiet girl who had barely spoken when she first arrived, now chatted constantly about Goldie's training progress and her plans for expanding the herb garden. Marcus had taken over much of the heavy farm work with a maturity that impressed Sam daily, often staying late to help with repairs that required adult supervision. Goldie had grown into a beautiful young dog, her golden coat gleaming with health and her intelligence evident in every interaction. She seemed to understand her role as the farm's ambassador, greeting each child with personalized enthusiasm while maintaining a special bond with Sam that brought him comfort during the long evenings. Catherine had become a regular presence as well, often staying after dropping off the children to help with administrative tasks that Sam had let slide for months. She had quietly taken over correspondence with the bank, bought groceries with her own money, and even arranged for a local veterinarian to examine Goldie at no charge. "You know," Catherine said one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the children play with Goldie in the yard, "I've been thinking about your situation here and ours at the home." Sam nodded, his stomach tightening with familiar anxiety. The closure of Meadowbrook Children's Home was only 6 weeks away, and despite numerous appeals and fundraising efforts, no solution had emerged. The thought of losing these children who had become so integral to his daily life felt almost as devastating as the prospect of their being separated from each other. "I've been thinking too," Sam admitted, "about a lot of things actually. This farm it's too big for one old man, but it's perfect for a family. A big family." Catherine turned to look at him, her eyebrows raised in question. "What I'm trying to say," Sam continued, his voice gaining strength, "is that I want to help. I want to do whatever it takes to keep you all together." Over the next hour, as the children played and Goldie supervised their activities with the seriousness of a seasoned border collie, Sam and Catherine talked through an idea that had been forming in his mind for days. The farm was large enough to house multiple families. The barn could be converted into additional living space. The land, while currently unproductive, had good soil and access to water. It would take significant investment, Catherine warned, converting buildings to meet state regulations for a children's home, ensuring proper safety measures, meeting licensing requirements. "I've got some money set aside," Sam said quietly. "Insurance from when Martha passed. Savings I never touched because I couldn't see any future worth investing in. But now," he gestured toward the children, whose laughter filled the evening air, "now I can see exactly what it should be used for." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Sam was working in the garden with several of the children when a convoy of vehicles pulled into his driveway. His heart sank, recognizing the official plates and thinking the bank had finally come to foreclose. But instead of bankers, out stepped a group of people he didn't recognize, led by a well-dressed woman with a warm smile. "Mr. Morrison," she called out. "I'm Janet Pierce from the Nebraska Department of Children and Families. We've been hearing some interesting reports about what's happening here." Sam's blood ran cold, immediately fearing that someone had complained about the children's presence on his property. But Janet's next words surprised him. "We've had several calls from community members who've noticed the positive changes in these children since they started coming to your farm. Their teachers, their caseworkers, even some of the volunteers at Meadowbrook have been reporting remarkable improvements in behavior, academic performance, and general well-being." Over the next 2 hours, Janet and her team toured the farm, interviewed children and staff, and listened to Sam and Catherine's proposal with growing interest. They examined the barn conversion plans that Marcus had helped Sam sketch out, reviewed the financial projections Catherine had prepared, and observed the obvious bonds that had formed between the children and their unexpected guardian. "This is highly unusual," Janet admitted as her team prepared to leave. "But the outcomes speak for themselves. These children are thriving in ways we rarely see in institutional settings. If you can meet our licensing requirements and pass all necessary inspections, we'd be willing to work with you on transitioning Meadowbrook's operations to this location." That evening, as the children reluctantly prepared to return to the home for what might be one of their last nights there, Sam felt a lightness in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Martha's death. The future, which had seemed so bleak just a month ago, now stretched ahead filled with possibility. "Goldie," he said to the young dog who sat faithfully beside his chair, "I think we're going to need a bigger doghouse." As if understanding the magnitude of the moment, Goldie barked once and wagged her tail, her bright eyes reflecting the same hope that Sam felt building in his heart. The forgotten farmer had found his purpose again, and in doing so, had discovered that sometimes the most profound rescues happen when you think you're simply lending a helping hand. The wagons disappeared down the dusty road, but for the first time in months, Sam wasn't counting the hours until their return. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring the children back home to their farm, their family, and their future together.